The manager's voice carried across the entire lobby. "That jacket tells me everything I need to know about whether you can afford what you're asking for." 20 people turned to look. A security guard took a step closer. And the man, standing at the counter, a torn green field jacket hanging off his shoulders, one sleeve held together with safety pins, said nothing at all. He simply reached into his back pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. 3 minutes later, that same manager would be standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box in his hands. And the entire branch would understand exactly why you should never judge a man by the condition of his coat. Stay with me. This one is worth every second. Elijah Carter had owned that jacket for 11 years. The stitching along the collar had been redone twice by his own hands. A needle and thread kept in the glove compartment of his truck for exactly that purpose. The left sleeve had a tear near the elbow that he had never bothered to fix properly, just enough thread to keep it from getting worse, because some things a man keeps not out of necessity, but out of memory. The jacket had been his brother's. Marcus Carter had worn it through 2 deployments before he came home the last time in a flag-draped box, and Elijah had worn it every single day since, through summer heat and winter cold, through job interviews and funerals and ordinary Tuesday mornings, because putting it on felt like carrying his brother's weight for one more day so his brother wouldn't have to. He was 44 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way men get from 20 years of manual labor, with hands calloused from a decade running his own construction crew and a face that had weathered more than its years should have allowed. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light he had learned to ignore. He lived in a modest 2-story house on the edge of town that he had built room by room over 6 years, working nights and weekends until it stopped feeling like a project and started feeling like home. He was raising his daughter alone. Her name was Nadia, she was 10 years old, and she had her mother's quiet intelligence and her father's stubborn patience. And she was the reason Elijah got up every morning without needing anyone to remind him why. Nadia's mother had passed 3 years earlier, cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for, and in the time since, Elijah had learned to braid hair badly but with care, had learned which cereal was acceptable and which was an insult to breakfast, had learned that grief does not disappear. It just learns to sit quietly in the passenger seat while you keep driving. He had never once complained about any of it. His father had raised him with a simple rule, repeated so many times it had become part of his bones. You do not perform your hardship for an audience. You carry it and you keep moving. On a Thursday morning in early spring, Elijah walked into First Meridian Trust with Nadia beside him, her small hand tucked into his. Both of them dressed for an ordinary errand rather than anything that mattered. He needed to withdraw funds for a payment due that afternoon, a supplier invoice for lumber that his crew needed by Friday morning, nothing complicated, nothing that should have taken more than 10 minutes. He wore the jacket because he wore the jacket every day, torn sleeve and all, over a plain gray t-shirt and work jeans still faintly dusted with sawdust from the job site he had left an hour earlier. Nadia wore her school backpack, having asked to come along because her father had promised her ice cream afterward, a small bribe for patience that neither of them minded. The bank was quiet at that hour, mid-morning on a weekday. Only a handful of customers scattered among the teller lines and the seating area near the front windows. The branch had been renovated recently, marble floors and glass partitions, and the particular hush that comes with a space designed to feel important. Elijah had banked there for 6 years, ever since he'd opened his business account to keep the construction company's finances separate from his own, and he had never once had a problem, mostly because he had never once had a reason to interact with anyone beyond a teller and a polite nod. Today was different, because the teller he approached, a young woman with a nervous habit of glancing toward the manager's office between customers, looked at his jacket for slightly too long before looking at his face. "I need to make a large cash withdrawal from my business account," Elijah said, sliding his identification and account information across the counter. The teller took the documents, typed for a moment, and then her expression shifted into something careful and hesitant. "Sir, this amount will require manager approval. Let me get someone." Elijah nodded. That was standard procedure for withdrawals of that size. Nothing unusual, and he waited patiently with Nadia beside him. her legs swinging slightly on the tall chair she had climbed into near the counter, her attention fixed on a coloring book she had brought for exactly this kind of waiting. The manager who emerged from the glass-walled office in the back was a man named Gregory Holloway, mid-50s, silver hair combed with obvious care, a suit that had been tailored rather than bought off a rack, and the particular walk of a man who believed his position entitled him to be noticed before he arrived anywhere. He crossed the lobby with unhurried authority, took the documents from the teller without acknowledging Elijah directly, and studied them for a long moment before finally looking up. His eyes moved from Elijah's face down to the torn sleeve of the jacket, lingered there, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of performed skepticism. The look of a man deciding in real time how seriously he was going to take the person standing in front of him. "This is a significant withdrawal," Holloway said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearby seating area, where two other customers glanced up from their phones. "I'll need to verify a few things before we can process this." Elijah said that was fine. He understood the bank had procedures, and he was in no particular hurry. Holloway did not move to process anything. Instead, he stood there for a moment longer, looking at the jacket again, at the safety pins holding the sleeve together, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed into something quieter and more deliberate. The kind of quiet that is designed to be overheard rather than to actually protect privacy. "That jacket tells me everything I need to know about whether you can afford what you're asking for," Holloway said. The words landed across the lobby with a particular weight, not shouted, but clear enough that the two customers near the window both turned fully now. And the teller behind the counter went very still, her hands frozen over her keyboard. Nadia looked up from her coloring book, her eyes moving from the manager to her father, reading the room the way children do, sensing wrongness before they can name it. Elijah did not raise his voice. "I have an account with this bank. I have identification. I have the funds in the account you're looking at right now on your screen. I'm not asking for a loan. I'm asking to withdraw my own money." Holloway's expression tightened slightly, the look of a man who did not enjoy being corrected in front of an audience, even an audience of two uninterested strangers and a nervous teller. "We have to be careful about large cash transactions," he said. "There's been an increase in fraud attempts recently, people presenting documents that don't match their actual financial situation. I'm sure you understand the caution is necessary." The insinuation sat in the air clearly enough that nobody in the lobby needed it, explained further. "I understand caution," Elijah said evenly. "I don't understand why my jacket is part of the conversation." Holloway's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the seating area, toward the two customers who were now watching openly, and something in that glance suggested he was performing for them as much as he was speaking to Elijah. "Perhaps if you'd like to avoid this kind of scrutiny in the future," he said, "you might consider dressing in a manner more consistent with the amount of money you're claiming to have. It would save us both some time." A woman near the window audibly inhaled. The teller's face had gone the color of the marble counter she was standing behind. Nadia set down her coloring book. Her voice was small but clear in the quiet lobby. "Why is he being mean to my dad?" The question hit the room harder than anything Holloway had said, the way children's honesty always does, cutting straight past the performance adults build around their cruelty. Holloway looked at her for a moment, and something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, but an awareness that he had an audience he had not accounted for. He recovered quickly, turning his attention back to Elijah with the practiced smoothness of a man used to talking his way past discomfort. "I think it would be best if you stepped aside while we sort out the verification process," he said. "Perhaps take a seat. This might take some time." Elijah looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, but with the particular stillness of a man deciding how far to let something go before he intervened. He had spent enough years managing a crew of 20 men to recognize the specific behavior of someone who mistook a title for actual authority, someone who had never been meaningfully challenged and had built an entire personality around that absence of resistance. He thought of his brother, of the jacket, of the 20 years since he'd worn a different kind of uniform and understood what real chains of command actually looked like. How little they resembled a man in a tailored suit, performing power in a bank lobby for two strangers and a 10-year-old girl. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Elijah said. Holloway's expression flickered with something close to amusement. "I am the supervisor of this branch. There's no one else to speak with. That's simply how this works." Elijah reached into the back pocket of his jeans and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from having been carried for longer than the situation should have required. He set it on the counter without unfolding it. "Then perhaps you'd like to call the number on the back of that," he said quietly. Holloway looked at the paper with visible reluctance, the expression of a man who suspected he was being maneuvered into something he did not yet understand and resented the sensation intensely. He picked it up anyway, because the alternative was standing there doing nothing while a growing audience watched him hesitate. He unfolded it and read it, and the color that had been steady in his face for the entire exchange began very slowly to drain out of it. It was a letter, printed on official letterhead, several months old, addressed to Elijah Carter regarding his role as an advisory board member overseeing a regional expansion review for First Meridian Trust's parent holding company, a position he had been appointed to 8 months earlier following the acquisition of his construction firm's commercial real estate portfolio by an investment group tied directly to the bank's ownership structure. The letter carried a signature at the bottom that Holloway recognized immediately, because it belonged to a man 3 levels above him in a hierarchy he had spent 15 years trying to climb. Holloway read it twice. His hand had gone slightly unsteady. "This," he said, his voice smaller now than it had been a moment earlier. "This is several months old." Elijah nodded. "It is. I don't carry it around to use it. I carry it because I forgot it was still in that pocket from a meeting I had downtown last week. I wasn't planning on needing it today." Holloway looked up at him, and for the first time since Elijah had walked into the lobby, he seemed to actually see the man standing in front of him rather than the jacket he was wearing. "Sir, I had no idea. I would never have." Elijah held up a hand, not sharply, just enough to stop the sentence before it finished forming. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect. You needed to know who I was before you decided I deserved any at all. That's backwards. That's always been backwards." The lobby had gone completely silent. The teller behind the counter had both hands flat on the surface in front of her, watching with the particular stillness of someone realizing they had just witnessed something that would be discussed for weeks. The 2 customers near the window had fully turned in their seats now, phones lowered, watching without any pretense of doing otherwise. Nadia looked up at her father, then at Holloway, then back at her father, working through the shift in the room with the careful attention of a child assembling a puzzle from pieces the adults around her thought she couldn't see. Holloway set the letter down carefully, as though it might tear further under the weight of his hands. "Mr. Carter, I would like the opportunity to make this right. Let me process your withdrawal immediately, and I want to personally." Elijah shook his head slowly. "This was never about the withdrawal," he said. "You were always going to process it eventually. This was about what you said before you thought you had a reason to be careful. You looked at a torn jacket and decided everything you needed to know about the man wearing it, and you said it loud enough for a room full of strangers to hear in front of my daughter. And you were comfortable doing that because you believed there would be no consequence for it. That's what I'm interested in. Not the money, the comfort." Holloway opened his mouth, and whatever he intended to say did not make it out, because at that moment the glass door at the front of the branch opened, and a woman in a charcoal suit walked in with the brisk, unhurried pace of someone who had received a phone call and rearranged her entire morning around it. Her name was Renata Fields, and she was the regional director overseeing 17 branches across the district, including the one they were standing in. And she crossed the lobby floor directly toward Elijah with an expression of genuine concern that made Holloway's spine visibly straighten in anticipation of whatever was coming. "Mr. Carter," Renata said, extending a hand that Elijah shook, "I got a call from corporate the moment your name came up in the branch system flagged for a manager escalation. I came as soon as I could. I'm very sorry for whatever has happened here this morning." She turned to Holloway, and her expression shifted into something considerably less warm. "Gregory, Tell me what happened. Holloway's mouth worked for a moment before words emerged, and when they did, they came out smaller than anything he had said in the last 20 minutes. There was a misunderstanding regarding a withdrawal. I was following standard verification procedure. Renata looked at him for a long moment, then turned to the teller behind the counter. "What did you observe?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying the specific weight of someone who already suspected the answer and simply needed it confirmed on the record. The teller hesitated only a second before the words came out in a rush, as though she had been holding them the entire time, waiting for someone to finally ask. Mr. Holloway told the customer his jacket told him everything he needed to know about whether he could afford what he was asking for. He said it loud enough that the whole lobby heard it, and then he told him to dress better next time if he didn't want this kind of trouble. Her voice shook slightly by the end, not from fear, but from the relief of finally saying something she had wanted to say from the moment it happened. Renata closed her eyes briefly, the particular gesture of someone absorbing information they wished they didn't have to. When she opened them, she looked at Elijah with something close to genuine distress. "Mr. Carter, I don't have adequate words for how sorry I am that this happened in one of our branches, and especially in front of your daughter. This is not who we are, and it will not be treated as a minor incident." Elijah nodded slowly, his expression neither triumphant nor particularly softened, simply steady. The look of a man who had seen this exact pattern enough times in his life to recognize both the apology and the accountability that would need to follow it for the apology to mean anything. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I want to be clear about something. This isn't really about me. I have resources. I have an account balance that will absorb an insult without real damage. What I'm thinking about is the person who walks in here next week wearing the same jacket, without a letter in his back pocket, without a board appointment to smooth things over. That person deserves the exact same respect I should have gotten from the first sentence out of his mouth, and they're not going to get it, because nothing about how he thinks has actually changed. It's only the consequence that's changed today because of who I turned out to be. That's not the same thing as fixing the problem." Renata was quiet a moment, absorbing that, and something in her expression suggested the point had landed. "You're right," she said, "and I'm going to make sure this branch and every branch in this district understands that the standard doesn't change based on what someone is wearing or what car they drove up in." She turned to Holloway, and her voice, when it came, carried no theater in it at all, simply the flat, unavoidable finality of a decision already made. "Gregory, I need you to gather your things. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your position at this branch pending a full review. What happened here this morning is not a judgment call I can defend, and it is not the first complaint of this nature that has crossed my desk with your name attached to it." Holloway's face had gone entirely gray. He looked at Renata, then at Elijah, then at Nadia, who was watching the entire exchange with the serious, unblinking attention of a child determined to understand every piece of what adults were doing around her. "I've worked here for 15 years, Holloway said, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. Renata's expression did not soften. "Then you've had 15 years to learn that this isn't how you treat people who walk through that door. And somewhere along the way, you decided you didn't need to. That's not something I can undo with a warning." Holloway did not argue further. He walked slowly toward the back office, and a few minutes later emerged carrying a small cardboard box with a framed photograph and a few personal items, and walked out through the glass doors into the parking lot without looking back. The teller who had spoken up, whose name tag read Priya, stood at the counter with an expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief, as though she had expected some cost for her honesty and was still processing the absence of one. Renata turned to her directly. "Thank you for telling the truth when it would have been easier not to," she said. "That matters more than you probably realize right now." Priya nodded, and something in her posture straightened. The particular effect of being seen and valued for a choice that had felt risky in the moment it was made. Renata personally processed Elijah's withdrawal herself, apologizing again as she did, and offered to have someone from corporate follow up with him directly regarding the incident, an offer Elijah accepted without particular enthusiasm, because he had learned a long time ago that formal apologies from institutions rarely change the culture that produced the problem in the first place. And the only thing that ever really mattered was whether people continued doing the work after the cameras, so to speak, had turned away. Before they left, Nadia tugged on her father's sleeve. The torn one, the one held together with pins. "Daddy," she said quietly, "is that why you always wear this jacket? Because it makes people think things that aren't true." Elijah crouched down to her level, ignoring the lobby around them entirely for a moment. "I wear this jacket because it was your Uncle Marcus's," he said. "It's not about what people think when they see it. It's about what it means to me. People are going to look at things and decide what they mean before they know anything real. That's not something you can control. What you can control is who you actually are underneath it, and whether you let their assumptions change that." Nadia considered this with the careful seriousness she brought to everything, then nodded once, filing it away the way children do with things they intend to remember for a long time. 3 weeks later, First Meridian Trust rolled out a mandatory training program across all 17 branches, developed in direct response to the incident, focused not on procedure, but on something the corporate materials called Dignity First Service, a phrase that made several longtime employees roll their eyes privately until they sat through the training and found it considerably less hollow than the name suggested. Priya was promoted to assistant branch manager within the month, a decision Renata made personally, citing the exact quality of character the branch needed more of. Elijah returned to the bank periodically over the following months, not because he needed to prove anything, but because the ordinary business of his life required it, and each time he walked through those doors in the same torn jacket, he was greeted by name, treated with the same unremarkable courtesy every other customer received, which was, in the end, the entire point. He never asked for anything beyond that. He had never wanted special treatment. He had only ever wanted the treatment everyone deserved before anyone had decided whether they'd earned it. On a Saturday morning, some months later, Elijah stood in the kitchen of the house he had built with his own hands, the jacket hanging on its hook by the door where it always hung when he wasn't wearing it, and watched Nadia at the table finishing a bowl of cereal before school let out for the weekend. She looked up at him and asked, out of nowhere, the way children ask the questions that have been sitting quietly in them for a while, waiting for the right moment. "Daddy, do you think that man learned anything?" Elijah considered the question honestly, the way he tried to consider all of her questions, because she deserved real answers rather than easy ones. "I don't know for certain," he said. "But I know the people who work there now are treating folks better than they used to. And sometimes that's the only proof you get that something changed. You don't always see the inside of a person. You just see whether what comes out of them is different than it was before." Nadia nodded, satisfied with that, and finished her cereal. And outside the kitchen window, the ordinary Saturday continued exactly as it would have continued regardless of what had happened in a bank lobby months earlier, because that had never been the point of any of it. The point had always been smaller and larger at the same time. The simple, unremarkable, entirely necessary fact that a torn jacket tells you nothing about the person wearing it. And the moment you decide otherwise is the moment you've already failed the only test that actually matters. That evening, after Nadia had gone up to bed, Elijah sat alone at the kitchen table for a while with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The house quiet around him in the way it went quiet every night once the day's noise had settled. He thought about his brother, about the years before the jacket had become something he wore instead of something he simply owned. He did not think about Holloway with anger. He had stopped being angry somewhere in the parking lot that morning, once the box had been carried out and the moment had passed into something smaller than it had felt while it was happening. What stayed with him instead was the shape of the silence in that lobby right before Renata walked through the door. The specific quiet of people who had watched something wrong happen and said nothing until someone gave them permission to. He thought about that kind of silence often, because he had lived on both sides of it. The years he had spent quietly accepting smaller versions of the same moment long before anyone had handed him a letter that could change a room's temperature in an instant. Most people who experienced that moment never got the version of it that ended with an apology and a box carried out to a parking lot. Most people simply absorbed it and kept moving, the way his father had taught him to, the way he was teaching Nadia to now. Not through lectures, but through the plain evidence of how he carried himself on ordinary days. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be taken seriously before they've proven anything. They shouldn't have to prove anything at all. Respect was never supposed to be a reward for looking a certain way. It was supposed to be the starting point, the thing you offer before you know a single detail about who's standing in front of you, because that's the only version of it that means anything. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more waiting for you here.